to introduce myself to you, although I think I've spoken to all of you in the course of your interviews, but perhaps you don't know enough about me, or perhaps you don't know at all about me. So I am one of the founding faculty members of the Public Policy School. I joined in 2012 when we launched the school. And prior to that, I was basically working with the government. I'm a career civil servant. I was in my last position, economic advisor to the Union Finance Minister, who then became president. So I was with him, and in his last tenure as a finance minister, I was economic advisor to the finance minister. And then I chose to take voluntary retirement from the government and pursue my interest, and which was to return to academics and be a part of a process to set up the first public policy school in the country. So even as a career civil servant, I have been basically engaged in policy making at the national and at the international level. I was with the UN for about 6 years in between the 27 years I've spent with the government of India. I spent 6 of those years with the UN working on some issues. So I have been a policy analyst, and later on in my career, a policy maker at a reasonably high level, in the highest level in the government of India. I'm an economist by training. I've studied in Delhi University, and then I'd gone to the London School of Economics. In Delhi University, I studied at the Hindu College. I did my graduation in economics there, followed by a master's in Delhi School of Economics. And then subsequently, I went to the London School of Economics. So my training as an economist and my practice and experience as a macroeconomist, I call myself a development economist who works on macroeconomic issues in development. So, but then I have diverse areas of interest, including issues related to estimation of poverty, inequality, human development. I was the author of the first National Human Development Report for India, which was published in 2001 while I was at the Planning Commission. It was published in 2002. It is called the National Human Development Report 2001, and I was at that time in the Planning Commission. Subsequently, when I joined the UN, I worked on a very interesting area. In fact, I was the first economist hired by that particular agency of UN, which works on human rights. So my job was to find a bridging language between development policy discourse and the human rights discourse. And I built that bridging language by quantifying human rights, creating indicators which were anchored in human rights normative framework. And that allowed some of the human rights concerns to be reflected in the policymaking context. So I did that work. I published a book which has become a UN bestseller. It has sold more than 100,000 copies in the UN system. And then I came back to India from the UN. I chose to come back. I resigned my UN job and came back to India. And then subsequently, I was appointed as the economic advisor to the finance minister. But one of the reasons I left the government service was my interest in doing something more concrete to the discipline of policy making. And I started with a project called the India Public Policy Report. And the first of these reports was published in 2014. We started the school in Jindal in 2012, and in 2014 I came out with the first India Public Policy Report. And the idea behind this report was to create a mirror for the policymakers in India at both the central and the state levels. So I'll have occasions to talk about this report and what one is doing. And I'm actually working on the sequel to the first edition. We have been held up over the last year or two because some of the data was not released by the Government of India. And so that work, which is quite evidence-driven, is held up. But I propose, as and when the data becomes available, and some of you would have heard this controversy about the numbers. The official statistics have been questioned by a lot in India. I'll touch upon that also in the course of this talk. So that's one of the projects that I wanted to do. And I thought I couldn't do that while being in the government. So when an opportunity arose for me to move out, I moved out. And here I am today in front of you, looking forward to engage with you as we begin our new semester shortly. You have already had a few lectures so far, and so you would have been told that the idea of the Prestige program was to just get you thinking and get you rolling so that you can hit the ground running when you start the semester as of 1st of September. But importantly, it was also to introduce some of the faculty members to the group. And so here I am. I've done my introduction. I have had the opportunity to have the introduction of all of you when I interviewed you. So we'll get to know each other a little more subsequently. I would come and teach you in the second semester. I teach generally courses in economics on macroeconomic theory for policymakers. Then I teach something on public economics, public finance, and administration in India a little bit. And hopefully, now that we have a decent number of students and in this cohort, maybe I'll offer some electives as well as we move forward. But we also have a new master's program in economics, so things will evolve. In any case, I will teach you 2 major economics paper in the course of the next 2 years that you spend with us. So let me stop here, my introduction. Is there any question? I normally break every 10-15 minutes to give opportunity for you to ask anything that you have. Otherwise, I will start my talk on the theme that has been given to me this morning, and I will speak on that. But I'll open the floor for just 1 minute if there are any questions, clarifications at this stage. Floor is open. Okay, since I see no hands, let me begin with the title, with the theme of today's talk. Well, the title is Theory and Practice, Policy as the Linking Practice. At one level, this title it was given to me by the program director for public policy programs, Professor Milindo Chakravarti, who has already spoken to you earlier this month. So I find this topic tautology at one level. It is quite obvious that between theory and practice there has to be some linking factor, and that linking factor is the act of applying theory and the knowledge coming out of theory to practice. So policy making has to be a linking factor between practice as it unfolds and theory as one has learned, acquired the knowledge. And so it is, to me, some sort of a tautology. But it is not always the case that practice emanates from theory and practice is mediated through policy making. Why do I say this? And what do I mean by this statement? Well, if you look at the developing world, and why just go outside India, we can stick with the case of India. If you look at the case of India, policy making has gone through various phases in our country, and I will talk about these phases in a minute. But by and large, policy making hasn't been given the kind of importance it ought to have been given. And I feel that as a result, our policy outcomes have been suboptimal mostly. We have come a long way since independence. We have done very well in certain areas. And the biggest plus for our country, I feel, is that we have grown as a country. We have strengthened and been together despite the immense diversity in culture, language, religion, and so on and so forth in our country. That's the biggest plus. If you look around the world, there are many countries which either became a federal entity or became a union of states, but they've all disappeared. We are a union of states, and our union of states, I would say, has reasonably strengthened over the years. Of course, there are very major areas of concern, and it doesn't behold well for our thinking at one level, and our it does impact our hope for the future. But by and large, I would say the biggest plus of the country has been that we have stayed united and we have stayed one, despite the inherent factors which should have actually moved in the direction of breaking up of the country. But that hasn't happened. You look at Yugoslavia, you look at Soviet Union. Soviet Union doesn't exist. Of course, we have Russia, a major part of what was earlier Soviet Union, and a few Central Asian republics, which are now independent states. Yugoslavia doesn't exist on this map. You look at many countries in Africa which kind of got decolonized and became independent around the same time or a little later than India, but they're broken further and so on and so forth. The biggest strength has been this. However, and this strength has come from the way our forefathers who brought independence to this country institutionalized certain processes and structured the way we had to govern ourselves. And I'm basically referring to the beauty of Indian Constitution, the strength of the Indian Constitution, which has seen us through some very difficult and testing times, including the time that we are going through now. But more on that later. What I was basically trying to say is that policy making has not been given due recognition in our governance structure. Anybody and everybody who was in a position of taking decisions would take decision based sometimes on inadequate information, inadequate knowledge about the issue, and policies were made. In fact, at one point of time, we used to have, and although this culture has diminished since the late 90s, but we used to have a 15th August syndrome in the government. And what was this syndrome? Around 2 weeks prior to 15th August, which was, as you know, is our Independence Day, and that's the day when the Prime Minister addresses the nation from the ramparts of the Red Fort. So we would get a call about 2-3 weeks prior to that, and I have firsthand knowledge of this because I used to coordinate while I was in the Planning Commission. I used to coordinate the commission. The commission comprises at that time the vice chairman and the members of Planning Commission who were at the level of ministers of state, and the commission itself was chaired by the prime minister. So commission would be, and I used to coordinate. I used to be the coordination of coordinate the secretariat of the commission. So although I was having other mandates also, but I used to coordinate that. And so I was in the thick of things happening in the commission on a day-to-day basis. So I have first-hand knowledge. The joint secretary concerned in Prime Minister's office who was my nodal counterpart in the Prime Minister's office would call up and say, okay, we need some ideas about what the Prime Minister needs to announce on the 15th of August, some new schemes, something which is unique, which stands out and is politically the right thing to do. And there we would go looking for, scrambling for new schemes and new names, and sometimes renaming some of the old schemes and so on and so forth. So that's how sometimes big policy decisions were made. In other words, the policy making process and I will talk about the 3 pillars of policy making, were never really touched upon. And the result, in my view, was that we were, in most cases, landing up with suboptimal consequences of whatever policy initiatives we had taken. So although we have come a long way, but I think we could have done far better than what we have done. And part of that blame lies on the policymakers. But these policymakers were either turncoats, they were generalist administrative service officers who were making policies without inadequate knowledge or without inadequate expertise, or it was being led by political decision-making process with an eye on politics more than what was good for the economy, for the society. So the discipline as such hadn't taken root as it has taken root in some of the developed countries in the West. The fact that until 2012, this country did not have a taught master's program or even an undergrad program on public policy speaks for the attention or the lack of attention being given to this discipline. You all would be aware, and I hope you are, because that reflects your general awareness, that every university worth its salt in the US has a public policy program. It's even the bread and butter of most universities, because that's where people go to study and be a part of, as a kind of a stepping stone to be a part of public life in that society. So thank you. I see my colleague Milindo Chakravarti has just joined. Thank you for being here, Milindo. I will continue with my talk since time is very short. So I was mentioning about how the discipline has been given importance in some of the developed countries, and that in fact has contributed to the quality of policy making in that country. Whereas the policy making was happening by default in our country and in many developing countries. Well, we could live with that kind of suboptimal policy making process in the earlier part of our development. Well, we were starting at a very low base. Life was simple. The complexity of economic management were not as difficult as they are today. So, we could willy-nilly manage the policy-making process, and we could do. But as things are getting complicated, as things are, and we are a part of the larger global economy. You've heard this, that if America catches cold today, India would start sneezing tomorrow, or something to that effect. What does that suggest? It suggests that in an integrated economic, political, and social world, impulses, economic and other social impulses, travel from one corner to the other. And what does that do? Sometimes these impulses are reinforcing some of the good channels working in the economy, then it is fine. But sometimes they have to be countered well in time so that they do not destabilize the process which is underway. So public policy as a discipline has acquired a fair amount of seriousness, and it needs to be taken up seriously. So the point I was making was the fact that policy making was taken very casually for the large part of our early development process, reflected in the fact that we didn't have a taught master's program in our country, or leave aside a master's program, even a taught BA program in public policy in our country. We of course had institutions which would train the civil servants for policy making, but it was just, and that also reflected one sadly another kind of lacuna in the way we were looking at institutional capacity for policy making in the country, and that was the fact that it meant that policy making was just the domain of the government servants, the government elected government, and the bureaucracy that supported the government, which itself is a incorrect kind of assumption to make, or a suboptimal reality to work with. Policy making involves each one of us, we are all stakeholders in the policy making process, and we have to contribute to that. The fact that we didn't have these taught courses, the fact that policy making was left as the sole business of the government and its apparatus reflected the kind of importance we attach to public policy. So, going back to the theme of this topic, uh, 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 why is it that policy making should be the linking factor between theory and practice? What is the theme trying to suggest? The theme is trying to suggest that policy making has to be practiced um, as a science and applied as an art in a manner that it does justice to the society where it is being practiced. It cannot be done in an ad hoc manner. It cannot be done in a suboptimal manner, because the costs of missing the bus, or the opportunity cost of not doing or getting things right, is far too high in the kind of world that we now live in. Having said this, let me now try to give a bit more of flesh to this whole theme by posing the question, what is policy making? And I will develop from that initial question. And I'm sure that in the talks that you've so far heard, and from your understanding of this discipline, you already would know that policy making is about solving social problems. And since social problems or problems which have a human interface are rather complex, a human being is not a unidimensional creature. A human being has a political, social, economic, anthropological, sociological, and so on, cultural dimension. And so when you are trying to look at problems that affect human life, there is an inherent complexity to be dealt with. And if those problems have to be successfully addressed, well, you need to bring in and leverage knowledge from a multitude of disciplines which impact that problem at hand and have a bearing on the problem at hand, and then find solutions. And while you're doing that, you also need to have certain skill sets which are somewhat unique to policy making, and somewhat and not necessarily unique to policy making, but these are skill sets which you can borrow from other disciplines in order to understand the consequences and the implications of a particular problem at hand, and then finding solutions to it. So public policy is about solving social problems. When does a problem become social? Well, when it is affecting a larger set of individuals or institutions in a society. If I'm not getting on well with my wife, it is a personal problem. But if you find that all of us who are a resident of a particular area, the incidence of divorces or violence against women increases, or there are a lot of people who are not getting along with their spouses, then perhaps it starts acquiring a social problem, a social dimension, and then it becomes a subject matter of social action, and which is where policy making and policy initiative then becomes important. So, having briefly touched what is public policy, let's look at who are the policy stakeholders. They are, of course, government, because we elect a government in a democracy to work on our behalf. But that doesn't absolve you from your responsibilities. You have certain responsibilities as citizens. Your responsibility involves engaging with some of the issues which are important for you, for the society at large, and contributing to the process of decision making, which is socially acceptable, socially desirable, and reflects the larger consensus in the economy, on the society. So as stakeholders, we may act directly, or rather we mostly act indirectly through the government, but increasingly the civil society, with whom you could have a more direct interface, or you could be a part of civil society even as you are, professionally engaged with other issues. You could use that platform to be a part of the policy making process. So basically, everybody has a role to play in policy making. It can't be left solely to the to the to the to it solely in the hands of the government. And there is one good reason, especially in the current context, why that is important. Government does not know everything about everything, uh, as well as perhaps some of the experts working in that area, and they may not be part of the government. And since I've had hands-on experience of policy making in the country, I can tell you there are many instances where the government did not know fully. It was not fully informed, fully knowledgeable about what it was doing. Yet it had to do that, take those steps, and I'll give you an example in a minute. And so it is willing to accept good, reasoned advice. Not always, of course, and especially not when it an advice which interferes with the political priorities of the regime. Then obviously they would not accept. But in many instances, at least the technical part of the policy making process, which is generally manned by civil servants and experts, they are willing to listen, especially when they're confronted with situations where they do not know what to do. And I have one instance to share with you. So this was the time when I was in the finance ministry, and I was part of the union budget team, along with the 5 union secretaries from Ministry of Finance, which involved expenditure, revenue, Department of Economic Affairs, financial services, and disinvestment. And this team was headed by the finance minister. And since at that time, and there used to be also chief economic advisor, and the chief economic advisor during those days was a gentleman, my teacher at Delhi school, called Professor Kaushik Basu. He was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. So he was part of the Department of Economic Affairs, and I was part of that union budget team by virtue of being the advisor to the finance minister. Now, so this was the time when the 2G scam had already come out into light, and there was a lot of noise in the media, and political parties were making it an issue. And the idea was that since after 2G, the next spectrum was sold at a much higher level. So the argument was that 2G was undersold, et cetera, and you know about the scam. And at that time, we started we started auctioning. We changed the policy on the spectrum, and we wanted to auction it. And so we were going to auction a certain bandwidth in the particular year when the budget was being prepared. And the budget had to take into account the expected revenues to be realized through that auction. So when we were putting down the numbers, I was pitching for a number which to everybody on the team looked very high. I said that we should get about 30,000-40,000 crores easily out of the auction of this particular spectrum band. And the telecom secretary who was invited to make a presentation and all this said, we won't get so much because the maximum we could get is about 20,000 or something. Do you know when the auction actually took place and how much did we realize? We realized 1,17,000 crores out of that auction. So even the best of the estimates, or the guesstimates, so to say, for the potential revenue to be realized were way off the mark. And I was pitching for a higher revenue realization on that. And even that was being made fun of by my other colleagues that this is unrealistic. So there is always a gap in the knowledge basis when one is making policy, and that's why we need to engage expertise of all kind to inform that process and have more policies formulated which have the more chance or likelihood of being successful and optimal in their consequences. So all the stakeholders have a role to play, and these roles have to be mediated through a process of policy making which is transparent, where the information which is relevant for policy making process is available in the public domain, so that public debates could inform the process of policy making one way or the other. And in fact, one of my objectives, I mentioned to you, the India Public Policy Report project, was to, in fact, create a platform where certain issues could be analyzed threadbare, and the state of art on that issue could be put in one place, which could then be kind of injected into the public discourse, into the policy making discourse, with a view to improve our policy making process. So the nature of policy making has to provide that link between theory and practice, and this nature of policy making has to benefit from 2-3 things. One is basically the theoretical understanding of the issue, which comes from disciplinary studies which have a bearing on the issue. The second is the issue about evidence. One has to take into account evidence and work with the evidence and the theory to then put it into practice. But there's a third element to this process which is often ignored. Policymaking also uses what is called informed intuition. Despite our knowledge, despite our skill sets to use that knowledge and marry it with the evidence that we see on the particular issue that we are working on, ultimately there's an element of intuition, and this is not just random intuition that you get while you are daydreaming or subconsciously thinking while asleep. It's not that kind of intuition. It is a more informed intuition, which also actually benefits from knowledge and awareness about the state of play on the issue on you are working. So policy making has to make use of these 3 ingredients, and if it makes and does justice to all the 3 ingredients, then policy making definitely and that is the kind of policy making that has to provide that interface between theory and practice, with then practice feeding back into the policy making process. Now, question is, what has happened in India? How seriously have we taken the policy making tasks in the government? And here, if I look at historically, if I go back to the independence time and then start from there, I would say that the first phase of policy making in India was pretty solid. Why was it solid? Firstly, I would say there was a very solid intellectual political leadership in the country which took that task of policy making seriously. And I'm basically referring to the Nehru era. Had that era been devoid of the leaders we had at that time, and I'm not just referring to Nehru, I'm referring to Patel, I'm referring to Ambedkar, I'm referring to Govind Ballabh Pant, I'm referring to K.M. Munshi, I'm referring to a whole lot of these. I'm referring to Maulana Azad. I'm referring to Zakir Hussain, and so on and so forth. This enlightened intellectual political leadership recognized that in that phase of our development process, we needed to bring in the expertise. We didn't have sufficient expertise. We had just come out of the colonial era. And of course, we had several towering economists already at that time, a gentleman called V.K.R.V. Rao, who set up the Delhi School of Economics and several other institutions. We had P.R. Brahmananda, who gave a model of development which was in some sense opposed to the model of development that we adopted, the Mahalanobis model of heavy industrialization. Anyway, we had towering people, but this political, intellectual, informed, enlightened political leadership didn't hesitate in getting the best of the experts. So you would be surprised to know that many of the eminent economists who later on, some of them became Nobel laureates, were all invited to India. And they contributed to the first few couple of decades of our policy-making process. But then what happened when this leadership went away? My sense is that the bureaucracy acquired a monopoly in policymaking. And this was the phase of 70s and even 80s when the bureaucrats ruled the roost. This was also the phase when Panchayati Raj got its teeth, and it kind of, in a sense, strangled the private initiative in the economy. But let's not get into those other aspects of this discussion. The point I was just trying to say, the policy-making process was largely bureaucratic in these 2 decades. But that's the time when certain restlessness started showing up in the society, and the civil society started also maturing, and they started taking a lead. So this was the third phase, which began, I would say, in the mid 90s, or some would say maybe even early 90s, when some very articulate individuals who led some of the civil society organization started actually taking part in policy-making process wholeheartedly, and with a fair amount of rigorous expertise, rigorous analysis and expertise to back what they were saying. So the result of this phase was that a lot of our major policy initiatives, especially in the social sector, especially issues like the Right to Information Act, the Right to Education, and other such initiatives started actually, they were not the initiatives which the government actually took. The government was reasonably open, and that's how things actually fructified, but the initiative came from civil society. So this third phase already started enlarging the process of policy making. It started making it more participatory, and it started injecting a certain amount of expertise, and I would say a certain amount of ground reality into the policy making process. So in a sense, if I look at the policy making, it has 3 pillars: the normative ethical basis of public action. The second is taking account the evidence. And the third pillar is the quality of the process, which puts all this together. Now, what happened in the 90s with the civil society taking initiative is that this quality of the policy-making process started becoming more participatory, more broad-based than what it was earlier, and especially in the era of bureaucracy having a monopoly over policy making. And then we move on to the fourth phase, which I don't think has actually been entered sufficiently as yet in India. And this is the phase where you have popular participation in policy making, where policy making is absolutely decentralized. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. So I mentioned to you earlier that I worked for a while with the UN system, and I was based in Geneva. Now, Geneva is at the border of Switzerland and France, and there's a big, huge freshwater lake there called Lake Limau. It's a very huge lake, and perhaps the biggest in Switzerland and maybe in Europe. This lake then flows into a river which goes into France. So, Switzerland is known for a few industries, the watchmaking industry, the pharma industries, and it's also known for Swiss banks. Now, these typical, and of course, cheese, and some wine, but mostly cheese. Now, these commercial activities were on one side of the lake in Geneva. The banks and the big watchmakers uh, who have very deep pockets, and they have a huge voice also in the society. They were on one side of the lake. At the other side of the lake, you had all these UN organizations which have their headquarters in Geneva, and a little bit of local population and their habitation. So 6 years I was there. Every year, the canton, which is equivalent of a district, so to say, an administrative unit in that country, was trying to put an additional bridge across that lake, just so to decongest the traffic, which the commercial interests were not happy about. So they wanted another bridge so that maybe by Indian standards, there was hardly a traffic jam, I would say. It would mean a wait of maybe 2 or 3 minutes to cross over. But even that was not good enough for the commercial interests. And so they were lobbying for a second bridge to be laid out there. And this is an example of popular participation in policymaking. So the cantonal authorities in Geneva had to vote that proposal every year, because every year it would get defeated. And once it was defeated, they couldn't put it on the table for another 12 months. So I saw that 6 times this proposal came to the public domain, and the residents of Geneva were asked to vote on that proposal. And every time, because they valued their quality of life and they thought that bridge would compromise that quality of life. So they wanted not to have the bridge. So they voted against it. And the cantonal authorities couldn't get that bridge placed. Now, so this is an example of how popular participation in policy making should happen, or could happen. And there are countries who use referendums. Our own Mr. Kejriwal tried to do this when he was elected as the Chief Minister of Delhi on certain issues. Now, whether he was genuinely wanting to do that or it was a gimmick or something, that's for you to figure out and make up your minds. But the point I was basically trying to make is that our policy making process in India has gone through different phases, good and bad, and it is still not good enough for the fact that we don't have enough trained policymakers in the country. And we are at a stage in our economic transition, in our development transition, when the quality, the opportunity cost of policy making has become very high. If you get it right, you will do well. The country will do well. If you don't get it right, or it is not timely enough, it has a cost which, as a society, we have to bear. And this transition can be expedited. This transition can be more fruitfully undertaken. That I'm talking of the transition, the development transition, provided the policy making process improves. And when I say policy making process, it's not just about writing policies. It's about writing, formulating, and implementing policies. We need to improve that. And that's what I think our school is trying to contribute to. And we hope that some of you would be, once you graduate, you would be dirtying your hands with the kind of data, with the kind of skill sets and knowledge which is required to improve the quality of policy making in India. And if we get our policy making right, we would transit much faster to our desired social goals. Let me end, and before I end, let me just make one other remark, and then I'll open up the floor for a few questions. I was a part of a study recently, which was a UN initiated study. There's an institution called UN Wider, which is in Helsinki, which does research on development policy issues and development issues. So there was a gentleman called Gunnar Mardell, who you would have heard, some of you would have heard. He was a Swedish economist, diplomat, politician, who was also at one point of time stationed in India because his wife was the ambassador of Sweden to India. Incidentally, this couple is, I think, one of the two couple Nobel laureates. One was Madame Curie and her husband, I think, and the other is Gunnar Myrdal and I'm forgetting the wife's name, and her, who both got a Nobel Prize in their lifetime. So Gunnar Myrdal wrote a book called The Asian Drama. It was published in 1968. This book was about his reading of what would happen in Asia. And Asia at that time was largely India and the Indian subcontinental countries. His book didn't cover China and some of the other Southeast Asian countries. So he came to a very pessimistic picture on Asia's future because he said that the institutions do not exist, and there are many social, cultural factors which will prevent this mass of the world from not doing well. And that was also the time when many development economists, many leaders who were first excited with the experiment of democracy in India and therefore were engaged with India, started giving up on India and kind of wrote off India as a basket case, that it'll be forever not be able to quench hunger and take care of its multitude of people, hungry mass. So the point I was trying to make was that Gunnar Myrdal's Asian Drama was a very pessimistic picture on India's future, the Indian subcontinental future, and some parts of Asia, including Cambodia, Vietnam, which were part of Indonesia, which were part of colonies of the Western past. But 50 years later, in 2018, so UN Wider initiated a project to reassess what had happened in Asia. So it's not a sequel to Asian Drama, but it was carried out by a different set of people, economists of repute, some 25 odd economists from all over the world who contributed to this project. And I was part of that project. I was the principal researcher on that project, helping the project director. And we studied Asia from 1965 till about 2016-17, to which the period for which we could have the data. And we came up with an analysis which is published. It is available on the Wider website, UN Wider, WIDER, Wider website. And the basic conclusion was that policy matters. Asia is the happening place in the world right now. And it is actually replacing the West from being the West for being the engine of the world. And China, led by China, and then followed by India, Vietnam, possibly Indonesia, and a few other countries. Asia is a happening place. And why has this transformation happened after such a dismal picture which was painted in 1965-68 by Gunnar Myrdal? And one of the principal takeaway of the study was that policy matters. If you get the right policies, of course, there are other factors, the conjunctural factors, which also matter, but policy, the quality of policy making matters. And if you get certain things right, you can actually speed up your transformation process. I will stop there, other than saying that all of you have an opportunity to be part of that transformation process and be part of the process, exciting process, where we all have to straighten out the policy making process, the quality of policies in India, and contribute to its development sooner rather than later. So I'll stop here. If there are questions, I will be happy to take. I don't know whether Milindo is still there. Yes, Milindo is there. But before I open up the floor, Milindo, do you want to say something?
It was a great presentation, and I hope the students will find inspiration of becoming quote unquote, the point that you made, I think that is the most important issue, that the country is lacking from a set of professional policy makers. And the whole approach of this program is to provide or gift the country with some trained professional policy makers. And I think that is the most important message that of this program, and you have made it very clear. I would just like to add one point. Maybe because of lack of time you missed it out. You are talking about the early stages of just immediate period after independence. There was another very important organization which was effective with the Planning Commission, called Program and Policy Evaluation Organization. And
Yes.
that organization is perhaps one of the first in the world to have been set up within a government system. Even America didn't have any such organization in 1951 when it was set up with the Indian Planning Commission. So when we are talking about a policy, we have been used to a sort of a situation where we think that a policy has to be changed, and we change it. But a policy for a policy to be changed, it is also necessary to find out as to why it has to be changed. It should not be just a cyclical process that after 20 years you change the policy. A policy, if it is good enough, it can be continued. But if it is not good enough, then it has to be changed even after 3 years. As you rightly mentioned, the idea of opportunity cost of policy making and committing a mistake in our policy process. But unfortunately, Indian policy making is not backed by any evaluation of the previous policy. It is not informed as to why the policy is required to be changed. Most of them happens at the spur of the moment with some political decisions. But our students who will come out perhaps will be in a position to assess the policy, evaluate the policy, and give us the correct insight as to whether a policy requires a change, and if yes, why. If this is not there, then policy making becomes a sort of a random process and mostly a political process. Thank you.
Thank you, Milindo, for making that point. In fact, I'm reminded, I have many anecdotes to share from my long tenure in the government, but here is one story which actually gels with what Milindo said, and I must thank him for bringing the role of policy program evaluation in the policy making process, and um, what kind of a role it has done, how it became defunct, and so on. So there'll be occasion to talk about it. But here's one small story which I like to narrate. So when we got independent, the whole country was actually in a bullock cart. So our state was like traveling from point A to point B in a bullock cart. You know what a bullock cart is? It has two wheels, and a pair of bullocks are drawing that cart. So the speed is slow and sometimes unstable. And we started our independence journey in such a cart. But a few years down the stream, we've got a little restless that we are not moving fast enough. We must do something to this. We must make our journey more stable, more faster. So somebody came up, a bright man came up with the idea that two wheels are not good enough. Let's add two more and make the whole thing more stable, and then we perhaps will start moving faster. So we had now a cart with had four wheels, but we still had two bullocks pulling it. And again, after a few more years, we felt that the pace was not fast enough. And so somebody said that let's move the bullocks, make it instead of two, put four. And then somebody said, no, we'll put a small machine in front, and a tractor was made to start pulling that cart, which was reasonably stable because it had four wheels rather than two with which it started off. Then what happened? As more and more people started getting opportunity to make policies, and sometimes ill-informed policies, somebody said, okay, this scheme is not working, let's put another scheme here, put another scheme there. So that was tantamount to adding one additional wheel to the cart every time you created a policy initiative. And so you acquired a contraption which had maybe 16 wheels which were not aligned with each other. They were moving in different direction, and there was a tractor pulling them. And above all, somebody had forgotten that if you wanted to move faster, you had to pave the roads, you had to fill up the potholes so that the journey could be smoother and faster. Now, the point I'm trying to make with this story is exactly the point Milindu just made, which is about, estimating, evaluating, understanding what is going wrong, and then setting things right rather than replacing one with the other. What have you seen in the last 6 years? Many of the schemes which were there earlier have been given a new shape, whether they have been structurally changed or based on some genuine evidence, knowledge, one doesn't know. So the point that Professor Chakravarti made about the role of evaluation and the feedback that should be carried back into the policymaking process is immensely important. And we have actually fallen short on that. And that's one of the reasons why we have fallen short in terms of the outcomes that we should have seen through the process that we initiated once we got independent. So let me stop here. I think I've taken too much of time. I'll take 5-7 minutes of your time, and if there are questions, now is the time to ask questions. We'll be happy to respond to you. Floor is open. Yes, Pranav, unmute yourself and shoot.
Good noon, sir. It's exactly 12, so I'm just saying good noon. And my question was regarding the fact that however much educated the policymaker might be, often he or she has to encounter with the minister who may not have the same sense of understanding. I
missed some of your words. Your voice cracked. Say that again.
So what I was trying to say was that however much educated and comprehensive the policymaker might be in his thought, often he or she has to encounter a minister who necessarily does not understand all the aspects of policy making or has electoral priorities more important than the policy making itself. How does a policymaker manage to bridge that gap? Considering that you yourself have worked with politicians, you have an apt experience of the same.
Okay. Thank you for asking this question, and I'll be very brief, and we'll have occasions to discuss some of these things when we actually get down to teaching.
Yes.
My sense is that politicians are not fools. They have their own rationality about the way they want to take decisions, and our job as policy analysts, assisting in the policy making process is to put various alternatives and the pros and cons of alternatives in front of them. And my own experience, you see, I worked with both the NDA government, the first NDA government, when I was having a very reasonably critical position in the Planning Commission, which was headed then by a gentleman called KC Pant. So I worked with that NDA government, and I think there were a couple of anecdotes from that time I will share with you when we are in the classroom.
Yes.
My experience was that if you take your analysis, take your suggestions, and you have your integrity is without question, and you have the confidence of these politicians, and you have the courage to speak up your mind based on good analysis, your suggestions get accepted. And that is exactly what happened with the UPA government also. When I was advising the then finance minister, there was never an occasion where some suggestion was being overruled only on political considerations. So a lot of us in the bureaucracy, we start paying lip service. We start second guessing the politicians and start saying things what we think they would like to hear, and that basically is happening because it is you have compromised your integrity, your professional integrity, and you are just towing the line for some pecuniary gains, and that then undermines the quality of the policymaking process. But my basic point is that there are, at least at the national level, there are politicians who have the larger interest in mind, and occasionally that would not be the case, but by and large. And then if you do stand up and you do your homework well, your suggestions do get picked up. And I'll share some anecdotes which prove my point, or demonstrate my point rather, when we talk at length in our classrooms.
Done, sir. Thank you.
Anybody else? Is there any other question?
Hello, sir. It's Rakshan here.
Yes.
So my question is regarding the curriculum. I went through the subjects that we have, and I did not see anything regarding development and human rights or inequality. And given your experience and expertise in these subjects, can we expect something in the form of electives for these subjects?
So, yes. So, themes like inequality, human rights, these are cross-cutting themes. You will come across them in several courses that are taught. As regards development, I think there is an elective on development economics in MA. And in fact, I'm toying with the idea, if a situation arises, I might offer that elective or something else when we come to that. But you see, as I mentioned, some of these themes are cross-cutting themes, and they will appear frequently across several courses. So you need not be worried. You will get exposed to some of these issues. They are at the heart of our development process, our transformation process, and they have to be dealt with in the course curriculum in some form or the other. Milindo, you want to add something there?
Yes, you should not worry, because there are courses on political philosophy of development, political economy of development, and there are also other courses where we are very conscious about considering the issue of inequality, which is emerging as one of the most potent threat to the stability of the not only Indian public policy system, but the global public policy system as a whole. So inequality is at the heart of the entire curriculum that we have developed. They will come often and again in several courses that are being offered, be it in terms of gender inequality, be it in terms of economic inequality or social inequality. All these issues will come very prominently in our discourse. And the second point that I am trying to make is that when you talked about development economics, we think that development is not a part of only economics. We consider it as a part of the total social game. So development will also come, and we have been very consciously arguing that development is not just economic growth. Development is beyond economic growth, and it includes social and other components as well. And they will feature very prominently in the several courses that will be offered to you during the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Maybe we can take one or two more questions if there are any. Muskan? Muskan, you had a question? No? If there are no other questions, should we bring the session to an end, or?
I think
okay, I see no hands.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can close this session. So we look forward to interacting with you further as we start our regular curriculum classes shortly. And until then, enjoy the most of the break that you have between your last degree and the next program, and have fun, and see you all again as of 1st of September. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Milindo.
Thank you, Rajeev. Thank you.
Bye.